Would it be fair to say that as a child of the 60s, you grew up obsessed with music?
I was just thinking about that, Dave. Yeah, it's funny. I was kind of going over some notes that I wrote for a call a couple of months ago, and from the time I was like 13 years old. I was fascinated with music, and I was actually living in Stamford, Connecticut, and I wanted to be popular with girls, like we all did. Um,
Yeah.
and and I went to the most popular kid in school, and I said, "So how do you get popular with girls?" And he said, "Well, you need to know about music, and you should be listening to Cousin Brucey on WABC."
Yeah.
And I said, "Really?" And that's when the love affair started. I love Cousin Brucey. I loved, of course, 1965, which is when that was probably the greatest year ever for music, because the British invasion was absolutely in its second year of exploding, and American artists began to catch up in 1965. So it was the best of the best, and so that was my introduction to pop music.
Tell me what you think about this, because I'm a child of the 60s too. And I think that particular era was unique in history, musically, and with regard to with society and as a culture, because we were moving from the era that our parents had with the hit parade and everything that preceded
Mm.
that, the big bands and so forth, but also the doo-wop era of the 50s. It all suddenly changed drastically in the 60s, and and we started to see this conglomeration of different types of popular music, everything from rock and roll to popular uh, softer hits and R&B and soul, and all of that stuff started coming down, and it actually created the culture that we grew up in and developed beyond that. So I think it was kind of a unique time, don't you?
Absolutely. It was like you took all that music that had come before, from Elvis to Jerry Lee Lewis to Chuck Berry, and of course all the doo-wop stuff after the payola investigation. That was funny. I was actually talking to somebody the other day who talked about why doo-wop had become so successful, because there was kind of a ban on a lot of the more aggressive R&B, so doo-wop became a thing as well. But you took all that music and you basically electrified it, and everything took a polish that had not been there before. And I'm not saying that the Goffin and King songs and things like that weren't polished, but there was a greater polish on everything, and everything kind of matured, if you will, whether it was folk becoming folk rock, whether it was bands emulating the Beatles, who changed everything, of course. It was just a maturation of music in 1965. And of course that continued to progress through the what we call the classic rock era in the early 70s through the
Right.
70s.
Well, you look at the producers at that time too, people like Phil Spector and George Martin, of course. Um, that changed the sound, and then everything just. I don't know about you, but I felt open to all of it. For heaven's sake, when I started working on the radio in top 40, uh, we were playing, we were playing all the Beatles stuff. We played some Jackson 5 at that point when it came around. But we would play. I could remember playing Led Zeppelin, and followed by the Doors, followed by Barbara Streisand, and you know, I mean, anything went. The soft stuff mixed with the hard stuff, and everything. Everybody seemed to love it all.
And that's what's wrong with music today.
Is
And
it?
I don't know if you've ever read anything I've written. Probably not. I've written a lot about the music cycle. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that next. Go ahead.
Okay, but th- I've been in radio since, thank God for people like you who lend out a helping hand and kept me in when I was, a bratty little kid who should have been fired. But I've had the thing of being in the radio business up until 2020, into 2020. And I actually, it was my decision to retire because my wife said, you know, um, I'm tired of you working 80-hour weeks and I need you around. So, but watching that and then writing about the music cycle, um, one thing I noticed that happened, and it's one of the, I call it the death of a thousand cuts that radio's put itself through. And I've written about, that's one of the things I've written about a lot, about the death of a thousand cuts that we did to ourselves. But one of the things we did was we niched ourselves as the top 40 did, where no, you can't play that soft stuff and you can't play that rock stuff. Oh, geez, let's leave that to our alternative radio station that's down the hall. We don't want to take their music. And so this whole idea is the top 40 or CHR, some people call it, had to be this narrow niche format was insanity, because what made top 40 great was that it played everything, as you were referencing just now.
Well, a lot of that was a matter of assumptions made on the part of radio programmers, I think. They say, well, our audience won't go for that. Our audience wouldn't like what we now refer to as a crossover song, because that's country music. That doesn't belong on this station. And where in heaven's name would rap and hip hop have fit in those days?
Oh, they were, back in our day, they weren't played.
Yeah.
But they weren't played because they were seemed, they were. I had a good friend of mine who was a psychologist, and he would say, "Well, why aren't you playing this on your top 40 radio station?" When I was a consultant, and I would say, "It's too black." They go, "It's too black,"
Right.
and I go, "It's too black. It's just it will appeal." And I'm not being racist in what I'm saying. I'm just saying
Right.
the appeal to a white listener or to the mainstream is going to be too extreme. It's not pop enough and it's not melodic enough. And even the hip hop programmers that I work with at iHeart would talk about the need for melodic hip hop, and those songs would have been played.
Really.
So, but yeah, I mean, all those genres, basically, we just didn't play them back in, your day in the early 70s, or, and, my day in the late 70s as music director.
Talk about the labels that saying the song was too black. Of course, you couldn't get away with that today. I don't care who you are. but the euphemisms came along, right? Now, so we started calling it urban music, which I always thought was a little bit silly. So tell me about the music cycles that you discovered. And I honestly, I hadn't thought about it in the terms that you have established the concept. But when I read about what you're talking about, I went, well, yeah, I recognize that too. It's fascinating to me. Tell us about the 10-year cycles.
Okay, sure. And it's about 10 years. I mean, sometimes it's a little less.
Well, sure.
Sometimes, in the 90s it was. But the music cycle is basically a repeating pattern of music where it goes through three phases. And it's based on, basically the three core genres, which are pop, rock, and R&B. And I consider, ballads and things like that. They're a style, but they're kind of a form of pop usually. But those styles, those core genres change based on the phase of the music cycle. So in the middle of the 60s, for example, when the Beatles came along, there was the Beatles that were pop at the time. And well, actually, we considered them rock back then, and the Stones and the Animals and people like that. And then there was Motown, but Motown was very pop R&B, very polished, very well produced, written
Yeah.
by Holland. Just in incredible music background, or art instrumental background, and then rock, like, and then pop, was trying to think who else, Herman's Hermits and people like that. So that's the middle of the decade, is this what we call the birth cycle or the rebirth. Birth would have been when Elvis came. That was the beginning of everything becoming this, explosion of hit music and, pop music. So going back to the Beatles, it goes through a period where you have everything is very pop, 64, 65, 66, 67-ish. And then in 68, you get this progressive element, and rock becomes the dominant genre, for a lot of people, and it's more extreme in its sound. And that's the extremes period. And then, like, there's a reaction, and a lot of it has to do with how radio reacts to it. Whoever the gatekeeper is that controls the music and tells the record labels what they want, um, they became fans of softer music, and so you had the singer songwriter period in the early 70s, and that went on for 3 or 4 years, and each of these phases usually is about three or 4 years. Sometimes, usually the pop phase is the longest. It's usually 4 years, and the doldrums is usually a couple years, and the extremes is usually a couple of years. But it repeated and repeated. So I'm just, without being boring about this. In the mid 70s, it was the album artist. It was the Stones with Sticky Fingers. It was the Stevie Wonder with Inner Visions. It was Fleetwood Mac with their first successful album. That 74 to 76 period was a rebirth, and then it went into, and I don't want to get boring here. I mean, it that happened again. It went into extremes. The one in the late 70s was actually too much of something that was disco. So
Yeah.
so go ahead.
No, 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 that's all right. Go ahead. Finish your thought, please.
So anyway, so it repeats and it repeats and it repeats, and every 10 years you have that pattern. In 1980, after disco, you had that extremes goes into that real soft period that people call yacht rock, with Toto and Kenny Loggins
Yeah.
and Doobie Brothers and that sound, and every single doldrums, and we're in doldrums now. Country music makes a huge comeback, because we go back to, oh gee, country music is really great, isn't it? And everything else is crap. So we're going to start playing country music at top 40. And the last 14 weeks almost, of up until Taylor Swift came out with her latest stuff, the last 14 weeks on Billboard, all the number one songs were country songs. Morgan Wallen, Rich Man from North Richmond. I can't think of the guy who does it. And then there was another one. Oh yeah, Try This in a Small Town by Jason Aldean. So all those artists, country was number one for 14 weeks, for God's sake. That's never happened in the history of top 40 radio. So anyway, every 10 years, this pattern of birth, extremes, and doldrums happens, and then it goes on repeat.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong here, if I'm heading down the wrong path, but what I hear you saying on these patterns, these can't remember what you call them anyway, these 10-year patterns. It just starts off with innovation, and then that creates a new trend, and then the trends get finessed, or people say, okay, I want to do that too, but I'm going to do it this way, make it a little bit different, and so forth. What you get in the end result, after a long look back, is I think there are a lot of people, myself included, I'm afraid to say it, I don't like to say it, but I listen to country music now and I go, well, that ain't country music. That's crossover pop. country
Right.
music.
That's the Eagles.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So anyway, but I mean, like everything else, life goes on. Yeah, I read something recently where you, fairly recently, you said that right now we are in the worst doldrums ever. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is.
Why is that?
Um, we are in the worst doldrums ever because there are less consensus hits. It all began, during the COVID, when everybody was shut down and artists weren't recording, and it just kind of went into this lull, and that kind of started it. But add that in, it's like, what do they call it, the perfect storm, as some people say. You had that going on. You had the radio beginning to absolutely fall apart as far as doing the basics right. Just unfortunately getting greedy about commercial load, which is ridiculous. But again, you have to explain. That's explained away by the debt load. They bought these radio stations for way too much. That caused a lot of that too. And a decrease in focus on personality, which is, being a great personality. um you know Radio personalities are the lifeblood of radio. We always thought, yeah, well, music's the base of this John Coleman used to say, music is the base of the pyramid. Well, that's true, but without great personalities to stage music, to tell stories, to engage people about pop culture, you have no reason to listen to radio, especially today when you can go, you know, listen to a streaming platform and not sit through commercials and
Or
things
just
like
carry
that.
around 10,000 songs in your phone
Yeah.
that, that you've curated. And if the option, if the alternative isn't somebody who is interesting you, entertaining you along the way, then what's the point? I don't need to hear a guy just reading liner cards and then 6 minutes of commercials. So I think you're right.
Yeah. I remember my friend Sherman used to sit there and make the personalities read liner cards, and I and my girlfriend at the time would talk about, just, oh, I hate Sherman. She was working for him, and I was across the street working at KRQ in Tucson, and and he was brilliant. He was one of the most brilliant people about music, Sherman Cohen, ever. But anyway, not about personalities. He wasn't. So, but yeah, exactly. I mean, and it's funny because, and I'll get back to the perfect storm in a second, but there's a station in Edmonton, Canada, that's doing a lot of the stuff right. I'm trying to think what it is, like Now 102.3 or something like that. And it's playing very few commercials. It, pays for it develops its relationship with these advertisers so that, they, they do lots of remotes and things like that to kind of to get their return on investment by investing in the radio station. So and they have personalities around the clock that, they play a lot of music, but they also talk a lot, and they're engaged with the personnel. They're engaged with the listeners by, communicating on social media and texting and things like things that, you would have done back in the day. You would have been talking to listeners on the phone,
Mm-hmm.
and as a kid, I remember I would get so excited, to be able to call the request line and talk to somebody,
Yeah.
and it meant the world to me, that somebody would pick up the phone and talk to this, this pimply faced 14-year-old kid, so and anyway, but that's, as you stated, that's one of the things that's killed our businesses. We don't have enough investment in great personalities. Not saying that there aren't not saying there aren't great personalities, because
Right.
there are, but
Right.
there's a lot less than we need.
Well, I think the industry has forgotten about that largely, and I believe, at least from my experience, it all started when Bill Drake and Boss Radio turned programmers sideways. They didn't understand what he was doing. He wasn't eliminating personality by any stretch of the imagination. You listen to the people that were the big stars on KHJ and KFRC and on and on and on through, WRKO. These guys had personality coming out the ears, but they just learned how to be brief with it, which is to give it real impact and all that stuff. So people heard that and they say, "Oh, okay, we got to stop. We got to stop doing long stuff. We got to stop trying to be funny. We just got to introduce the hits. And hey, I know we can promote an event between records and that kind of stuff." And that's where it all went down the hill. It's like people not understanding what that was about. Don't you think?
1,000%. Uh, and during the 70s and 80s, all these, more music, less talk
Right.
radio stations, especially the light music stations. And, that's one of the Death of a Thousand Cuts too, where we allowed Arbitron to change its measurement to to hear versus listen.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I don't want to get off track, but that change, instead of making radio a foreground medium, it made it a background medium. And that also favored all those light music stations that played a lot of music so they could be heard at work, because work diaries became worth 10 times what a normal music station listening diary was,
Right.
to top 40.
Yeah.
So anyway, so all those, so that whole focus on that. And then there was, I won't say who it was, there was back in the early 2000s, there was a big research company that did a study, says, why are we, radio's having problems, and what's the reason? And it was, and the study goes, too many interruptions. And of course, those interruptions weren't commercials,
Right.
for God's sakes. Oh my God, not those commercials, and not those obnoxious sweepers. Turn your dot, rip your knob off your radio, and just a lot of obnoxious, meaningless sweepers instead of personality. But what they came up with was that we had to reduce personality. That was part of it.
Yeah.
So that big research company was listened to by a lot of big radio station companies, and they reduced the amount of talk that the personality could talk. So that's another big reason that we are in the doldrums that we are in today.
I think another aspect of radio was as you alluded to, is like the number of commercials. Good Lord. How can you expect people to sit through all that? Well, one way they used to sit through the commercials was that the commercials were entertaining. People realized, people in programming and in ad agencies understood that was what 15-20% of our product was the commercial. The commercial not only has to get your attention and sell you a product or a service, but it has to do so in an entertaining fashion. Otherwise, it's just turning you off. And now virtually every commercial you hear on any local radio station at any level of market was written by somebody in the sales department who really doesn't understand how to do that. And then just, then it's read live with all the grammatical errors and so forth. And you don't have people like Chuck Bloor out there turning out, genius productions that really identified the product or service and made people tune in instead of tune out.
He was amazing, wasn't he? Just an amazing man. I was lucky enough. He was dating one of my father's buyers. My father ran a clothing company back in the day, Judy's and Nobby's. So there's a gorgeous buyer, and so he started dating her, and my dad asked him to actually write me a letter of introduction to when I wanted to leave K Earth, and I went out to all the radio stations in the country, and I did not get a job from that, but it was Rick Leipert and KGB in San Diego actually said, I would like to hire you. Can you come down and do production? And I had absolutely no personality. My personality was not geared toward, doing commercials or imaging or anything like that. So I said, you should talk to my friend Jeff Prescott. And my friend Jeff Prescott wound up doing that, and then wound up being the morning guy for KGB eventually. So anyway,
When I went
but
to
Glore was brilliant.
when I went to LA for the second time, and right around 2000, I reached out to Chuck Bloor and said, "I've been, such a fan of yours for so long. I'd just like to stop by and say hello if you give me a couple minutes." He said, "Sure, come on down." He not only gave me a couple minutes, he gave me like 3 hours,
Wow.
and we just sat and we talked. We talked production, and a lot of people don't. I think don't believe me when I tell them it was like, when I first started out in programming. When I started out as a program director, I had the authority to pull commercials off the air if they were awful. I mean, can you imagine such a thing? You were in programming too. How did you try to make people understand, people in the radio station or in the company, understand that you can't just throw away this time that we're broadcasting. We've got to do something useful with it.
Absolutely. I mean, it all went back to, and you were, back at KHJ, that's one of the reasons Drake kind of lost his position, which kind of brought me into, to work with you. But Drake had fought Dwight Case, who was the sales manager
Right.
at KHJ, because I don't think he wanted to run a hemorrhoid commercial or something like that. And Dwight went all the way up to the top and fought him over it,
Bruce
and Drake
Johnson.
lost. Bruce Johnson, right? And
Yeah.
Drake lost his job. So it all goes back to who's in charge. And when I was at KZZP in Phoenix, I had an incredible general manager, a guy named Mickey Franco, and he backed me. And if there was something that was too obnoxious, whether it was sirens or something like that in the commercial, or just really obnoxious stuff, I was able to keep it off the air or have them redo it. But that happened less and less as my time in programming went on, or consulting.
You mentioned K Earth. Let's go back to the beginning for the two of us together. It was K Earth 1973. It was 50 years ago this year.
Yeah.
And I had just turned 22 and was programming the number 7 radio station in Los Angeles. It was automated, yes, but still, that was quite a position for me to have. And what happened, just to give a quick background for people listening or watching, is that as you said, Drake was booted out of RKO, and in the process, and I actually think it was Dwight. Dwight had become president by that point.
Okay.
Bruce Johnson had quit, so it was Dwight and Drake that had the falling out. So then Dwight hired Paul Drew to be vice president in charge of programming. Paul Drew called me as program director of the local FM station, and all the FM stations in the chain in RKO at the time, I think with one exception, I want to say Waxy in Fort Lauderdale, maybe WFYR, the Great Chicago Fire, as they call it. Anyway, we were all doing the oldies. We were all playing automated oldies. So Paul Drew said, "I want you to go to Boston and chair this meeting with these program directors, and we're going to get our own music going. And you need to get underway with making up the lists and recording the big 10-inch reels full of music and so forth." I don't know how to do that. But in Boston, I found a guy named Chip Hobart. Remember the late Chip Hobart? And
Yeah, sure do. Remember the
he
name.
did the production. He did the production, but I still needed somebody to put together the list and figure out what we should be playing. And that's where you came along. I don't remember the details, but I do remember that you were like either in high school or straight out of high school or something like that. And you
Yeah.
had an encyclopedic mind about music. Explain it from your perspective.
So yeah, I was actually it was the it was this my junior year of college at
Oh,
UCLA.
okay.
I may have looked like I was in
Yeah,
high
you
school
looked
because I always
yeah.
looked 10 years younger than I was. But and so I had been a fanatic about about music, and I collected record charts Billboard charts. I collected the KHJ charts. And my friend Sherman Cohen, who I mentioned earlier, had given me, because I got to LA in 1966 with my dad when he went out to work for Judy's, and so I started collecting charts, and then Sherman gave me KFWB and KRLA, and I wanted to understand what the biggest song of all times were. So um, that's why I got these charts, because I wanted to go through and calculate their lifespans based on their position on the chart. Number one got 30 points, thinking Boss 30. Number 30 got 1 point, and and so on and so on. And I calculated their lifespans, and I ranked it based on the points. And I got it written up in Warner Brothers Circular when I went looking for a job at Warner Brothers. They thought it was fascinating. They did my Los Angeles all-time top 1,000, and then Rolling Stone did one, but it had to be national, so I did it on Billboard. So that's and I remembered everything I calculated. So everything was just in my mind. I knew the peak of the song. I knew what month it peaked. So anyway, Betty Brenneman, who was music coordinator for RKO, invited me to come in and said, "I want to talk to you." And I started, like I said, pimply 14, pimply kid. I'm walking in and I'm asking her questions about KHJ, and she said, she found me interesting. And when you guys needed a music person, Hal Rosenberg called me in, and I came in, and he interviewed me, and then I met you. So that's how I got in to work with you at KEarth. And I knew nothing, Dave. I mean, I remember, you may not even remember this, because I remember everything like it was yesterday. It's unfortunately part of my, as you call it, encyclopedic
Yes.
mind. I remember everything. So, I remember you coming in, I remember putting lists together for you, and you said, "Well, do you know anything about tempo? Because you got too many slow songs here." And I went, what? So, and of course, tempo became a huge thing as I went into programming and consulting, because it was, essential to putting together, good hours of music, but didn't know anything about it at the time. Today I would have done those lists completely different than I did back then, but yeah, I know a little more than I did back then too. So, and I don't know if you want to talk about that Paul Drew incident, because that's pretty funny, and the inside story. You may not want to talk about it, but
No, sure. Let's talk about it. I don't.
okay,
I'm not even sure. Well, you say the Paul Drew story. I've got about a dozen of them, and
same here.
so what are we talking about here?
As I'm putting the list together, and I'm about 3 months in, 2 months in, before Paul becomes, whatever it is, VP, president, radio, and he's over all of us, and he's going to put his thumb down on the process.
Right.
So I put, yeah, as we know Paul could do. And I had put Jackie Wilson's Higher and Higher on the list. And I don't know why I did that, because I knew darn well that we covered like 50, 54, 55 to 1963. That's the era that KEarth specialized in. That was that nostalgic rock and roll era. But I put in Higher and Higher, which is 1967. I said, well, it fits, and I put it on because we needed songs, we needed something more R&B, and I get this call, and Paul's going, "What the fuck?" He's literally using every word at me, and I'm going, like, just in shock. And he goes, "What are you doing to this radio station?" And I go, "Paul," and
And
he
by the
goes,
way,
"Yeah."
that conversation did not start with, "Hi, guy, this is Paul Drew." He just starts screaming the minute you pick
Yeah.
up the phone, and it takes you a minute
Yeah.
to figure out who it is. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So he's absolutely unleashing the torrent of abuse on me, and I'm going, and I listened to him, and I got pissed, and I said, "Paul, if you don't like it, you can fire me." And he didn't know what to say. He sat there for 30 seconds, and it's like he was going, "No, who the hell had the balls to tell me that, especially this 21-year-old kid, for God's sake," And he just said, "Pause, pause, pause." And he goes, "Let me talk to Dave Williams." And I went, Okay. Hey, hey, Dave, Paul wants to talk to you. And that was it. And I go, I'm screwed. Probably my radio career's over, and I had Dave, I had no idea how important Paul was. I knew he was important, but I didn't know that he was probably the most powerful guy in radio at that time.
Yeah, he probably was. Yeah, what you discovered there was I don't. Paul had two sides to him. I rarely saw the nice side, rarely, but I know that it existed. And one way I know that, and it actually really pissed me off when he did this. This was about the same time. It may have been that same day. It may have been when you transferred the call to me at the time. I don't know, but he wanted to know, you know, how many reels have we cranked out in Boston? How many do we have in the can ready to go, or something like that, or what's the schedule? How are we on the schedule? I says we're a little bit behind. We've got 12 reels or something like that. Well, when are you going to get it done? I said, I don't know. Hopefully by, whatever I said. I said, and then he growled at me some more. I said, Paul, when do you want it done? And he said, yesterday.
Of course.
I paused for a second. I said, I can't handle that. If you want to talk like a rational human being, fine. Otherwise, I'll see. And he did the same thing that he did with you. He said to me, well, how about this time next month? Oh, I said, okay, I think we can probably do that. Next day, I walked into the office, and my secretary, we call him at the time, and now the administrative assistant, she said, Paul's on the line for you. I thought, uh-oh, here we go. I picked up the phone, and he said to me, how's the #1 FM program director in Los Angeles this morning? Sincere as you could be. And that just fried my butt, man. You mind game playing SOS, my point. And I do know people. I know people who really, really thought highly of Paul. And being that he's gone, and I don't like to speak ill of the dead. Like I say, he had another side to him, but boy, it could be tough trying to find.
He, so and before I move on about my good Paul stories, did he? So he didn't say. So when I transferred the call to you, you don't remember him saying anything about me or anything else?
No, I don't think so.
Oh my God!
I don't.
So
I don't.
I just put a big hand up and said, "Hang on," basically, and he just moved on.
Yeah.
He
Well,
just moved on.
here we go again. I was in his office one time at KHJ when he was program director there. It was before he became vice president in charge of programming. I don't know. I was just visiting or something. Anyway, he got a phone call. As he picked up the phone, he had one of those little one of those little sand timers, little egg timer kind of thing. He turned it over, and then he would talk to who he was talking to. And before the sand ran out, he goes, all right, got to go. Bye. And then he'd hang up. And he saw the look on my face, and he said, if a person can't call me and say what they need to say within 3 minutes, I'm not going to talk to him anymore. And that was kind of his approach to life. I remember walking down the sidewalk at Los Angeles airport one time after picking him up, and there was a crowd on the sidewalk, and he saw me step aside for somebody who was coming at us. He says, do this. He said, watch me do this. Don't move at all. They'll all go around. You don't have to move. They will. And that was his attitude about life.
Wow. Unbelievable. It's funny because you were one of the stories I was going to tell you was about the egg timer, and he gave me one. And I can't think of her name, who was his assistant at RKO later, Gail Mitchell. She's got one of them too, and he gave me one of them, and I've got it somewhere. Today I would treasure it because I know what it meant to him. I mean, you're telling me more than I knew. A famous story about his record meetings, because he had that meeting on Tuesday, that traditional, meet all the record reps on Tuesday meeting. And, and he always did that. He always had the little egg timer out, and people knew they had whatever it was, 3 minutes. Mm-hmm. So the 3 minutes that they had to talk to him. And one of the guys was a new young kid from and I can't think of his name, from Epic. And his guy was put full of piss and vinegar. He was a partier. He was a, kind of a wild child, and he wasn't going to put up with Paul's shit. So Paul does that. He'd been prepared. He was brand new, and he saw Paul do that, with the egg timer, and he goes, "You got 3 minutes." And he started talking, and he's going through his spiel, and and he's running out of time. And Paul's looking at the egg timer, and he goes, "Well, you better hurry up." And the guy got pissed off, and the guy picked it up and he threw it against the wall,
Oh my.
and it broke into 1,000 pieces. And Paul had a big grin on his face, and he goes, "I've been waiting for somebody to do that
Yeah.
forever." And he
Yeah.
said, and he goes, and he reached into his drawer. There was 100 more, and he goes, "Okay, you still got 3 minutes. I'll give you 3 more minutes, but you better hurry up."
That's a beautiful, beautiful story, and that explains him perfectly. Uh, I can see the irony and the humor and all of that. I could see what he was getting at when he would challenge people that way, but I didn't like it, and I was very young, and I just couldn't deal with it. Let me ask you about the technology and how it has affected music sales and music consumption. We can take just a couple of minutes. I don't want to take up your whole day here, but you know, uh, everybody I know, well, I should say everybody over the age of 30 or 40 that I know still longs for the day when they go to a music store or wherever and buy something they could take home that had in their hand. It was either
Mm.
a record album with beautiful cover and liner notes and all that stuff, or later on, CDs that still had all that stuff. And we all kind of miss that. Now we download music. Now we
Mhm.
listen to music for free, or we pay $15 a month to listen to the songs we want, and we don't own it. We don't feel any personal connection to it. Has that affected the industry?
Oh, I think it has. I think that it, just like you talk about with radio programmers and managers about personalities and underestimating their importance, or about commercials, I think that the industry has kind of forgotten how meaningful, the physical element was for having an album or a 45 or whatever it was, 45 with a picture sleeve. So yeah, I think that's a big part of what's happened. And uh people don't really make a lot of money. Artists don't make a lot of money from their music. They make their money from merchandising, and their concerts and things like that. They don't make a lot of money from their music, which is absolutely insane. And the music industry's kind of devalued the song, and just everything about the way things are created musically, whether it's people doing it all on computer, and the lack of the personnel, lack of the musicians all working together to create something magical. I mean, that's part of it too. Just the whole process has changed, so that's part of why music's devalued. And I think it's a big part of why we're kind of in the doldrums, going back to the music cycle, is that people who really don't, my friend Steve Perrin used to have this term when he talk about, people that that I thought were bright people, and why the radio stations were failing. And he goes, "They're DGI, man." And I go, "What do you mean DGI?" He goes, "Yeah, they're DGI, man." He's doing his Scott Shannon impression. And I go, "What?" And he goes, "They're part of the DGI club." And I go, "What the hell is the DGI club?" He goes, "They don't get it, man."
Ah,
So I mean, I think there's just a lot of people that don't get it and don't care. They're all trying to make more money from, as easily as possible. And the creative process is difficult,
well,
and
sure.
it takes human beings to do it, not,
And it's also
not
expensive if you're doing it correctly, right?
right,
The
right,
production costs of making a record that's not making
right,
anybody any money.
right.
What the hell?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly one of the biggest problems we face as an industry, whether it's radio or it's music industry, is that you know we don't want to invest in things that will cost too much money. And if you're not going to make a lot of money anyway from your music, how are you going to be able to pay for all those musicians and a great producer like you mentioned earlier, Phil Spector's of today? I mean, you're not going to pay for that.
Right. And you're not going to get into booking large concert venues either if you're if you're not selling the records. Sometimes
Yeah,
I wonder, why people bother to create music anymore. I guess it's just it's in them. It's who they are. It's their soul, and
yeah.
what they got to do. What about the future? Got a couple of thoughts about the future of radio, of music. Where's it going from here?
I mean, I don't know about music. I think we have to get back to all the things we just talked about. About appreciating that fellowship of artists creating something special, and reward them monetarily for that. Having great record label people, owners being willing to invest in that process. Without understanding how to make a hit song or how to make just something meaningful to somebody musically. Without that understanding and without willing to invest, it's going to be a problem for music for a while. Luckily you got Taylor Swift, who's made so much money with everything else she's doing that she can afford to do things the way she wants to do them. But how many people are Taylor Swift? One in a billion. And as far as radio, it's radio's got to get back to doing the things we talked about. I mean, they got to reinvest in personalities. They got to cut the commercial load. They got to make every single element on the radio station interesting again, including commercials. Including contests and having fun, and then connecting with the audience. Instantaneously, because we've created a world of short, as they used to, short attention span theater. People just don't have that attention span anymore to sit by, so you have to do it in a shorter amount of time. So just all those basics that we did and you grew up loving and I grew up loving, we've got to get back to doing that with the radio again.
I guess it's going to take people who are the age we were when we started. It's going to take the newer generation and the newer innovators to figure out how to put all that together and to redefine value in content for people. Guy,
Absolutely.
this has been great. Thank you so much. I have really enjoyed talking with you, especially given the fact that it's been 50 years since we've seen each other and talked at all. But I've watched your legend grow, and taken a certain amount of pride in that. I gave you a place to sit and do your job at K Earth, that old studio, which was an old house.
Was it? I didn't know it was an old house.
Yeah.
Oh God, in Fairfax and Venice.
Right. Yeah. All right, man. Thank you so much. I'll be in touch.
I love that.
Maybe we can
Let's stay in touch.
All right, and I'll let you know when this is ready to go.
Great. Thank you, Dave.
All right. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Bye.